December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor erupts into flame. Marine Gunnery Sergeant Tom Brewster presses himself low against a scorched warehouse, eyes glued to a military scope as a Nakajima Kate rips the sky above, spraying helpless sailors struggling in oil-slick water. At 800 yards, the plane is little more than a smudge through his issued Lyman 5A. Brewster squeezes the trigger anyway and watches his round trace harmlessly behind the bomber. The pilot keeps tearing across the harbor, unreachable, indifferent. 3 months later, in a cramped optical shop in Pittsburgh, a German immigrant named John Unertl stares at the same problem with a craftsman's impatience. The current marine scope, he knows, is serviceable up close but useless at the ranges Marines are now meeting. He slides across his workbench an 8-power civilian target scope, a model built for competition, not combat, and offers it to Captain George O. Van Orton with a reluctant shrug. "This was not made for war," he says. Van Orton peers through the glass and, to his own surprise, sees what had been invisible, shapes and edges 1,000 yards away coming into sharp relief. How did a delicate civilian optic, dismissed by some as too intricate for the front line, become the keystone of America's most lethal sniper system? That question would set the next months of testing, tinkering, and heated debate in motion, and change small arms warfare in the Pacific forever. The attack came without warning. The morning sun over Pearl Harbor had been calm, almost peaceful, as Marine Gunnery Sergeant Tom Brewster made his way toward the mess hall. Then, at 7:55, the sky shattered. Japanese bombers fell out of the clouds like hawks diving on prey, their engines screaming over the harbor. Battleships moored neatly along Battleship Row vanished behind columns of water, fire, and steel. Where younger Marines froze, Brewster moved. 20 years in the Corps had taught him to think before fear could catch him. While explosions tore through the airfields and machine gun fire stitched death across the base, he sprinted for the armory. He grabbed what he knew best, a Springfield rifle topped with the standard issue Lyman 5A scope, and racked around into the chamber. It should have been a familiar comfort. Brewster was an expert shot, a perennial high scorer at Quantico who could punch tight groups at 600 yards with ease. But nothing about this day resembled a rifle range. Smoke rolled across the harbor, flames reflected off the slick black water, and the burning stench of oil and cordite gnawed at every breath. Then he saw the pilot. A Japanese Kate bomber skimmed low across the harbor, methodically raking machine gun fire over wounded sailors trapped in the water. Brewster dropped prone behind a concrete seawall and set his sling. The distance, 800, maybe 850, registered instinctively. Normally, he'd take that shot confidently. Today, he could barely see it. Through the 5-power Lyman, the airplane blurred in and out of view, more smear than shape. The pilot wasn't a target, he was a rumor behind glass. Brewster steadied his breathing, calculated his lead, squeezed. The Springfield cracked. The bullet whistled harmlessly through open air. The Kate climbed away untouched. Brewster didn't curse. He only chambered another round and watched the enemy plane disappear far beyond the reach of his weapon. In that moment, as the harbor burned and survivors screamed for help, Brewster realized a truth that would echo through every battlefield of the Pacific. It didn't matter how skilled a Marine was. If he couldn't see his enemy, he couldn't kill him. The distance war had begun, and the Marines were not prepared. The shock of Pearl Harbor faded quickly into something far harsher, a grinding island-by-island war across the Pacific. Within weeks, Marine riflemen found themselves fighting on remote atolls and jagged ridges where every inch of ground was contested and every mistake paid for in blood. Reports piled up on desks at Marine Corps headquarters in Washington. Wake Island, Bataan, Guadalcanal. Different battlefields, same message. Enemy snipers were hitting Marines from distances they couldn't answer. Well-camouflaged Japanese marksmen equipped with long-range optics and disciplined fire tactics were killing Marines long before they ever came into range of American rifles. Training wasn't the problem. American marksmanship was as sharp as ever, but the tools were failing the men who carried them. Captain George O. Van Orton didn't need a report to tell him that. A seasoned competitive shooter and veteran equipment evaluator, Van Orton had spent years refining his understanding of ballistic performance and field reliability. At Quantico, he was a legend, an officer who could put steel on target at impossible distances. He believed in precision, he believed in engineering, and most of all, he believed you never sent a Marine into combat with second-rate gear. So when he was ordered to review complaints about the Corps' aging sniper equipment, he didn't treat it like a paperwork exercise. He saw it as a mission. The facts were undeniable. The standard Lyman 5A scope, designed during the last war, topped out at 5 times magnification and was built for controlled range shooting, not combat across broken terrain. Under perfect conditions, a Marine might make hits out to 600 yards. But in the real world, crosswinds, rain, moving targets, and jungle heat, the scope might as well have been a tin tube. That's why, on a freezing February morning in 1942, Van Orton stepped off a train in Pittsburgh. He wasn't there for a formal inspection. He was there to find an answer, or build one himself. And waiting for him, in a small optical shop on Liberty Avenue, was a German-born craftsman who believed he already had the solution. His name was John Unertl, and he was about to change Marine Corps history. From the outside, the little storefront on Liberty Avenue didn't look like a place where history would bend. Sandwiched between a hardware shop and a deli, it had a simple sign: Unertl Optical Company. No flags, no military contracts, no sign it held the answer to a battlefield problem no one else could solve. Inside, however, was a different world. The shop smelled of cutting oil and ground glass. Precision parts gleamed under lamplight. Every surface held micrometers, hand-lapped lenses, and unfinished tubes lined up like silent artillery. This was not a factory. It was a cathedral of craftsmanship, and at the center of it all was a man who believed perfection wasn't a goal. It was a requirement. John Unertl, a German immigrant trained in the tradition of European precision optics, had built scopes for civilian target shooters who lived and died by single millimeters. He believed in patience, tolerances, repeatability, ideas that didn't fit neatly into wartime production lines. He did the difficult work by hand, and he hated compromise. When Captain Van Orton walked into his shop, Unertl wasn't surprised. He had already received samples of the military's current optic, and he didn't hide his disgust for it. The Lyman 5A in his eyes wasn't just outdated. It was dangerous. "This is a hunting scope," he said in his thick accent, tapping the side of one with a screwdriver. "Not a rifleman's instrument." But Van Orton wasn't just there to criticize. He wanted to see Unertl's alternative, the scope the Marine Corps had already dismissed once as too fragile, too complicated, too risky for combat. Unertl placed it on the bench. It was longer, heavier, and more precise than anything in U.S. service. 8-power magnification, long, slender steel tube, external micrometer adjustments, built not for battlefield abuse, but for one purpose: extreme accuracy at extreme distances. "This Voss made for target shooting," Unertl warned, "not for mud and salt and war." Van Orton didn't answer. He simply lifted the scope, adjusted the focus, and peered through the glass. His breath stopped. Targets more than 1,000 yards away snapped into view as if they were inside arm's reach. Fine detail, crystal clarity. This wasn't an incremental improvement. It was a revolution. Van Orton slowly lowered the scope and looked at Unertl. What would it take, he asked, to make this ready for combat? That question would ignite a partnership, one built on tension, obsession, and a shared understanding. Marines were dying, and seeing farther meant living longer. The Marine Corps didn't leap at innovation. It resisted it. A few months after Van Orton's first visit to Pittsburgh, a crisp rejection letter arrived from Marine headquarters. Recommendation denied, signed by Colonel William Sterling. His reasoning was classic bureaucracy. "We do not change horses midstream. The Corps would stick with what it already knew, the old Springfield rifle and its outdated optics. Paper said no, but battlefield reports and body counts said otherwise." Van Orton pushed back, using an experimental program at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, to bypass red tape. There, a small hand-picked evaluation team would test not only Unertl's 8-power scope, but 2 rifle platforms. The existing M1903 Springfield and a civilian newcomer, the Winchester Model 70. On paper, the Model 70 shouldn't have been there. It was a hunting rifle. But in the hands of Marine marksmen, paired with Unertl glass, it began producing numbers that bordered on unbelievable, consistent 3.5-inch shot groups at 600 yards, sub-MOA precision, accuracy far beyond military expectations. Yet numbers weren't enough to silence the doubters. The Corps sent one of its toughest critics to oversee trials, Master Sergeant Bill Harrison, 20 years in uniform, hard-eyed, zero patience for gimmicks. To him, reliability mattered more than elegance, especially in combat. He didn't like what he saw. He turned the Unertl scope over in his hands, frowning at the exposed knobs and long steel tube. "This thing's got more moving parts than a Swiss clock," he muttered, "and twice as likely to break." Next to him, Corporal James Jim Mitchell, a Kentucky farm kid and natural shot, agreed. Mitchell had hunted since childhood with simple rifles. No nonsense, no delicate gear. He respected accuracy, but fragility got men killed. Their fears came true fast. When the coastal rain rolled in, moisture seeped into the scope. External adjustments began to bind. Slide stuck. Zero drifted after recoil. It took careful cleaning and lubrication to keep the system running. Luxuries no Marine would have in a firefight. By the end of the trial week, Harrison delivered his verdict. Too fussy, too fragile. This won't survive a campaign in the Pacific back in Pittsburgh. Those words landed like artillery, but Unertl didn't argue. He got to work. Every time something broke in North Carolina, a report landed on John Unertl's cluttered bench in Pittsburgh. He didn't treat them as criticism. He treated them as a blueprint. Where most manufacturers chased contracts and profits, Unertl chased perfection, and perfection was personal now, because his son was a Marine. Hans Unertl, barely out of his teens, was somewhere in the Pacific by 1942. Every scope John built might end up in his son's hands or in the hands of a Marine just like him. That thought didn't motivate him. It haunted him. So he stayed in the shop long after midnight, grinding glass and turning steel, while his wife Emma brought coffee and reminded him to sleep. He never did. Piece by piece, he began reforging the scope the Marines had called too delicate. He thickened the aluminum tubes. He redesigned the seals to keep out ocean humidity. He opened up tolerances so sand and mud wouldn't freeze the adjustments. He reworked the mounts to prevent shift under recoil. He solved the zero drift problem by machining mounts with tighter tolerances and recoil shoulders. He built a new return-to-zero sliding mount system that allowed the scope to be removed for cleaning and replaced without losing aim. He even hand-polished internal components to prevent micrometer knobs from binding in tropical heat. Every scope was hand-tested, every lens hand-aligned. Meanwhile, Emma turned a one-room shop into a wartime production line. She hired machinists, ordered steel, set up schedules. She was the engine. John was the fire. By late 1942, the first true Unertl Marine sniper scope was born. Stronger, smarter, reliable enough to ride into war, and it was about to be paired with a rifle worthy of it. The first production batches left Pittsburgh in late 1942. Wooden crates packed with gleaming national match rifles, polished bolts dulled to prevent flash, and newly hardened Unertl 8-power scopes, each accompanied by a thick care manual and a padded, moisture-resistant case. These weren't mass-produced throwaways. They were precision tools built to a craftsman's standard and issued only to teams judged capable of exploiting them. In the sand and blood of early 1943 assaults, the payoff was unmistakable. On atolls where enemy fighters had once moved with impunity beyond the reach of American small arms, Marine snipers began making deliberate, deadly hits at distances above 800 yards. Positions that Japanese units had counted safe suddenly weren't. Reports filtered back in breathless dispatches. Men neutralized well past the ranges the Corps had once accepted as the limit of small arms. For a time, the Unertl system looked like a battlefield equalizer. Then the Pacific reminded everyone how unkind its climate could be. In the humid jungles and rain-drenched islands, places where condensate formed inside bootlaces and salt clung to every seam, the The very refinements that produced razor-sharp accuracy began to fray. Units fighting in places like Cape Gloucester and other high-humidity theaters found the scope's delicate mechanisms binding, mounts creeping under sustained recoil, and optics fogging in the half-light of the canopy. Field reports that had once sung of newfound reach now read like a list of grievances, unable to make effective use due to climate and terrain. Those negative reports landed like grenades on the desks of skeptical officers. Colonel William Sterling, who'd argued against replacing tried-and-true systems, felt vindicated. The conservative caution that had once seemed obstructionist now looked prescient to many. Yet the human cost of not acting, the steady climb of Marine casualties in costly amphibious assaults, made indecision impossible. Faced with grim arithmetic, headquarters took a narrow, uneasy path forward. Rather than full adoption, the Corps approved limited procurement, a controlled rollout restricted to specially selected personnel and units, conditioned on strict maintenance regimens, specialized carrying cases, and issuance only on the precision national match rifles that could realize the scope's potential. The decision read like a compromise between hope and doubt, an operational experiment born of necessity more than enthusiasm. For Unertl and his small Pittsburgh shop, the order was both triumph and pressure. The Corps wanted performance in combat, but demanded durability in the wildest climates on Earth. Production ramped up. Manuals were written. Training programs drilled Marines on maintenance routines that could keep a fragile masterpiece working in a world that loved to break fine things. And on the islands, where a functioning Unertl rig kept a sniper's head down or saved a patrol from unseen fire, the difference between success and failure, life and death, was as immediate as a held breath and a steady cheek on a rifle stock. By late 1943, the sniper program was no longer an experiment. It was a lifeline. Every new assault across the Pacific came with the same brutal pattern. Marines crossing open beaches under fire from hidden Japanese positions dug deep into volcanic rock or dense jungle. Enemy snipers were still outranging American infantry, and commanders had a choice: adapt or accept higher casualties. So the Corps doubled down. Captain Van Orton finally received authorization to push ahead, not out of confidence from headquarters, but out of sheer battlefield necessity. The orders were cautious, almost reluctant, but clear. Produce more rifles, field more scopes, expand sniper deployments. If the equipment required careful handling, then Marines would be trained to handle it with care. If the optics needed maintenance, then they would learn to maintain them like life depended on it, because it did. The rifle chosen to carry Unertl's scope wasn't the Winchester Model 70 that had dazzled during testing. Headquarters refused to abandon tradition completely. Instead, they selected a precision-modified version of the Corps' old war horse, the M1903A1 National Match Springfield. These rifles had been originally built for competition shooting at Camp Perry. Tuned by master armorers, they featured hand-fitted bolts, star-gauge barrels, and bedding work that produced awe-inspiring consistency. Now they were repurposed for war. Blue-polished bolts were dulled to reduce glare that could give away a sniper's hide. Custom bases were machined into the receivers to mount the long Unertl optic securely. Then came the glass. Each Unertl 8x scope was hand-built with over 50 individually machined components. The 1.25-inch objective lens gathered more light than any optic fielded by U.S. forces. The external micrometer adjustments allowed precise shot corrections out to and beyond 1,000 yards. This system didn't just extend Marine reach, it changed battlefield psychology. Japanese soldiers began to fear open ground again. They hesitated. They hid. For the first time since the war began, Marines could take the long shot, but there was a cost. The scopes still demanded discipline, constant cleaning, careful storage, proper mount tension. They had to be protected from rain, shielded from salt air, treated like instruments rather than equipment. Many officers called them impractical. Others called them a miracle. To the Marines who carried them into battle, they were something simpler, a fighting chance. By war's end, just over 2,800 Unertl 8x scopes had been produced for the Marine Corps, an almost insignificant number compared to the millions of rifles carried into battle. But in the hands of the Marines who used them, those scopes reshaped what was possible on the battlefield. They extended vision, they imposed fear, they delivered precision when chaos was the enemy's greatest ally. The men who carried these long rifles weren't ordinary marksmen. They were scouts, hunters, patient ghosts who waited in silence and struck with intent. Their role rarely made headlines, yet their impact echoed throughout the Pacific theater. They weren't sent to trade bullets with the enemy. They were sent to control the battlefield, one shot at a time. When the war finally ended, these rifles didn't become museum pieces. They followed Marines into Korea, where snow replaced jungle rot, but the mission remained the same: reach farther, see sooner, fight smarter. Even into Vietnam, Unertl scopes resurfaced with Marine snipers who pulled them from storage, mounted them once again on carefully selected rifles, and took them to work in a new kind of war. Decades after their creation, they were still trusted. The U.S. Army never adopted them. The Navy and Air Corps had no use for them. Production stopped. The tools vanished from official inventories. And yet, their legend only grew. Today, original Marine Corps-issued Unertl Sniper Rifles are among the rarest, most sought-after military weapons in existence. They are tangible pieces of a story few know, but every marksman respects. Why do they matter now? Because they represent something bigger than steel and optics. They're a reminder of how innovation is born, not from comfort, but from necessity. They prove that a single determined individual like John Unertl, working with a team no bigger than a workshop, can change the course of military history. And they testify to a simple truth learned on battlefields across the world. Technology doesn't win wars, people do, armed with tools they believe in. The Unertl Sniper Rifle wasn't perfect. It wasn't mass-produced. It wasn't universally loved. But for the Marines who carried it into the storms of the Pacific, it earned its place in history the hard way. One precise shot, one saved life, one quiet victory at a time.